Nestled in the heart of a small Midwestern town was a rambling, weather-worn estate known as the Pierce House. For decades, it had stood as a symbol of forgotten grandeur, its white paint peeling like bark and its towering oaks casting shadows over a neglected garden. The house had once belonged to a family of prominence, bankers, politicians, and business magnates who commanded respect in their time. But for years, it had sat dormant, an eyesore to some and a mystery to others. When the notice went up that the house and its contents would be sold in a silent auction, the announcement caused a ripple of intrigue through the town. Nobody had seen the interior in years, and the details about the estate sale were scant. The organizers were not from the area, hired by a family member whose identity was as obscure as the reason for the sale. Rumors swirled. The house was haunted, the family had squandered their fortune, or perhaps a hidden treasure lay waiting inside its cavernous halls. The auction took place on a cold, overcast Saturday in January. Townsfolk and outsiders alike gathered in the front yard, where folding tables were piled with dusty antiques, stacks of yellowed books, and odd trinkets. But what captured everyone's attention wasn't the collection of weathered items. It was the house itself. Though its exterior had fallen into disrepair, it still exuded a quiet majesty. The second-floor windows were shuttered, and ivy clawed at the brick chimney, as if the house had been trying to hide its secrets. Among the crowd were seasoned antique dealers, casual bargain hunters, and a few nosy locals. Most were there for the spectacle, expecting to sift through forgotten heirlooms and snap up a bargain. Others came in search of something else entirely, an experience, a story to tell, or perhaps the faint hope of unearthing something valuable amid the cobwebs. One bidder, a wiry man in his late 30s wearing a nondescript gray coat, stood apart from the rest. His movements were purposeful, his gaze sharp as he scanned the property. Unlike others who lingered at the tables, he spent much of his time walking around the house, inspecting it from different angles. He didn't touch the items for sale, nor did he engage with the chatter around him. Occasionally, he'd glance at the auctioneer, who stood on the porch, clipboard in hand, taking bids. By mid-morning, most of the smaller items were sold off, and the focus shifted to the house itself. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. The rules were simple. Bids would be submitted anonymously in sealed envelopes. The winner would be announced within a week, and the house would be theirs to claim. The gray-coated man, who had remained silent throughout the morning, wrote his bid with a steady hand and slipped the envelope into the collection box. He lingered for a moment as if considering something, then walked away without looking back. A week later, the winner was announced. To everyone's surprise, the house had been sold for a fraction of its rumored worth. Whispers of disappointment and suspicion echoed through town, but no one had the energy to investigate further. Life moved on, and the house slipped back into its veil of obscurity. It wasn't long before activity stirred again on the property. Trucks came and went at odd hours, and the surrounding brush was cleared away, revealing more of the estate's hidden beauty. Lights flickered on in the evenings, but no one ever saw the new owner. Curiosity simmered. The locals speculated endlessly, their theories ranging from a reclusive artist to a criminal hiding in plain sight. One bold teenager climbed the iron fence late one night, hoping for a closer look, only to retreat in terror when a shadow moved across an upstairs window. The mystery deepened as months passed. Though the renovations progressed, no one in town had met the new occupant. All deliveries and communications seemed to be handled by intermediaries. A large wooden crate arrived one rainy afternoon, carried into the house by two burly workers who exchanged no words with each other or the neighbors watching from across the street. The intrigue reached its peak when an article appeared in the local newspaper. It described how the Pierce house had been part of a larger estate, once rumored to include secret passageways and concealed safes. The writer hinted at unsolved family scandals and missing records from the 1920s. Despite the buzz, the gray-coated man remained an enigma. Those who had seen him at the auction couldn't even agree on his name, and efforts to trace the house's new ownership led to a legal trust based out of another state. But the work on the house continued steadily, as if orchestrated by some unseen hand. One early spring morning, the townsfolk woke to an unexpected sight. The house, once veiled in gloom, now gleamed with fresh white paint and restored shutters. The overgrown garden had been transformed into a manicured landscape of neatly trimmed hedges and blooming flowers. It was as if the house had been resurrected, restored to the glory of its prime. But what drew even more attention was a new addition, a large brass plaque mounted beside the front door. By noon, a small crowd had gathered outside the gate to read it. The plaque bore only a single word, etched in elegant script, penance. The whispers began anew. What did it mean? Who was this person who had bought the house and transformed it so completely, only to leave such a cryptic message behind? As night fell, the house stood luminous against the dark sky, its windows aglow. Somewhere inside, the gray-coated man sat alone, staring at an object on the desk before him. It was an unremarkable box, its lid carved with initials barely visible under the dim light. He traced his finger over the grooves, his expression inscrutable. Whatever he had found, it wasn't the kind of treasure anyone had been looking for. The restoration of the Pierce house became the talk of the town, but the more the locals speculated, the less they seemed to know. While the house's exterior was immaculate and inviting, no one dared approach the gates. Even the plaque mounted beside the door, penance, remained a mystery. Who was seeking penance and why? The house stood like a monument to its own secrets, but the gray-coated man inside knew the truth was far less poetic. As he sat in the study one evening, the box on the desk seemed to taunt him, its carved initials drawing his gaze again and again. The object was old, its once polished wood now dulled by time, but the craftsmanship was precise. He had found it during the first week of his ownership. The box had been concealed beneath the floorboards in a small bedroom on the second floor, buried in layers of dust. It wasn't locked, but opening it had taken him days. Not physically, he could have lifted the lid at any time, but emotionally, the weight of its contents had kept him at bay. When he finally opened it, he was unsurprised by what lay inside. He had been expecting it, though he hadn't known exactly what form it would take. The box contained a collection of small, seemingly innocuous items. A bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon, a tarnished pocket watch, and a photograph in a cracked leather frame. The photograph was yellowed with age, showing a man and a woman standing stiffly in front of a grand staircase. Though their expressions were neutral, their posture hinted at unease, as if the moment had been staged. The gray-coated man, whose name was James, though no one in town knew it, studied the photo carefully. He had seen that staircase before. It was in the foyer of this house. The letters were harder to process. Written in elegant cursive on delicate stationery, they chronicled a correspondence that spanned several years. The language was polite but guarded, the tone that of business associates rather than lovers or friends. Yet beneath the formality, James sensed an undercurrent of tension. The sender, who signed each letter with the initial L, appeared to be a member of the Pierce family, though their exact role wasn't clear. The recipient's identity was even murkier. The letters referred to deliveries, transactions, and discretion, but the details were vague. One passage stood out. "I trust you understand the necessity of our arrangement. Should this ever come to light, it would mean ruin, not just for us, but for the house itself. You assured me once that no one would find out. Do not make me regret placing my trust in you." James read the letters several times, searching for clues, but they raised more questions than answers. What was this arrangement? And why had the sender been so desperate to keep it hidden? The pocket watch offered no answers. It was heavy in his hand, its face cracked but still functional. The initials LP were engraved on the back, matching those carved into the lid of the box. James spent the following weeks piecing together the fragments of the Pierce family's history. The public records told one story, a rise to prominence in the early 20th century, followed by a slow decline. The family's wealth had come from banking and real estate, and their influence had extended beyond the town. But by the 1960s, the Pierce name had all but disappeared. The house left abandoned after the last known heir moved away. The private story, the one hinted at in the letters, was more elusive. James combed through archives, searching for connections, but much of what he found had been deliberately obscured. Newspaper clippings from the 1920s mentioned scandals involving fraudulent loans and missing funds, but the details were always vague. One article caught his attention. It described a fire at the Pierce house in 1927, which had destroyed part of the West Wing. No one was injured, but the cause was never determined. The article noted that the fire occurred just weeks after the sudden death of Lionel Pierce, the family patriarch. The name Lionel struck a chord. The initials LP on the pocket watch and letters could easily belong to him. But if Lionel Pierce had died in 1927, why were the letters dated as late as 1932? The breakthrough came unexpectedly. While sorting through a pile of dusty ledgers he had retrieved from the attic, James found a single loose page tucked between the covers of an old account book. The page was brittle, its edges frayed, but the handwriting was unmistakable. It matched the letters in the box. This was no ordinary financial record. It listed a series of payments, each one marked with a date and a single word, atonement. The final entry sent a chill through James. October 12, 1932. Final payment made. The ledger is closed. James sat back in his chair, staring at the page. He didn't know what these payments represented, but the word atonement carried an unmistakable weight. Someone, likely Lionel Pierce, had been paying for something. And whatever it was, the payments had ended just before the Pierce family's decline. As the weeks passed, James became increasingly obsessed. He spent hours poring over the letters, ledgers, and photographs, trying to reconstruct a narrative from the fragments. He felt as though he were standing at the edge of a vast, dark secret, unable to see its full shape. The house seemed to feed his obsession. Though it had been restored to its former glory, James couldn't shake the feeling that it remained haunted, not by ghosts, but by the weight of its history. One night, as he sat in the study with the box open before him, he noticed something he had overlooked. The letters were written on fine stationery, but the final letter was different. Its paper was thicker, its edges slightly burned, as if it had been salvaged from a fire. The message was brief, almost abrupt. You have what you asked for. But remember, every debt must be repaid in time. Penance is not a choice. It is a certainty. James read the words again, his pulse quickening. This was no business transaction. It was a reckoning. He closed the box and stood, suddenly aware of the silence that enveloped the house. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, and the shadows on the walls seemed to deepen. For the first time since arriving, James felt the full weight of what he had uncovered. The Pierce house had been sold to him at a bargain, but he was beginning to realize the cost would be far greater than money. The house was quieter now, but not in a comforting way. There was a heaviness in the air, as though the walls themselves were bracing against something unseen. James had stopped working on the remaining repairs. His focus had shifted entirely to uncovering the truth behind the cryptic remnants of the Pierce family's history. The box sat locked in his desk drawer, though he had memorized every detail of its contents. The letters, the pocket watch, the photograph, they formed the puzzle's edge, framing the mystery but leaving the center blank. Yet it was the ledger page, with its chilling references to atonement, that James couldn't shake. He began visiting the local courthouse, digging through old property records and probate files, searching for anything that could shed light on Lionel Pierce's cryptic dealings. What he found only deepened the mystery. In 1925, Lionel Pierce had taken out an enormous loan against the house, a sum far beyond what would have been needed for simple repairs or upkeep. The records didn't specify how the money was used, only that it had been repaid in full within 7 years. On paper, it seemed unremarkable, but James knew better. The ledger page and letters hinted at something more sinister. The pattern became clearer as he widened his search. Lionel's financial activity in the years before his death was erratic. He sold off large portions of the Pierce family's landholdings at a loss, funneled money through shell companies, and made several large cash withdrawals that were never accounted for. Then there was the fire in 1927. The official report listed it as accidental, caused by faulty wiring, but James found discrepancies in the documentation. Several sections of the report had been redacted, and no insurance claim had ever been filed. It was as though the family had been eager to erase the incident entirely. The final piece came from a local historian, a retired teacher who had spent decades documenting the town's past. While leafing through one of her self-published books, James found a brief mention of the Pierce family's downfall. Rumors circulated that Lionel Pierce was involved in dealings of an unsavory nature, though no proof was ever uncovered. Following his death, the family's fortune dwindled, and by 1963, the last of the Pierces had abandoned the estate. James spent days turning the historian's words over in his mind. Unsavory dealings, atonement, penance. The clues pointed to something dark, a shadow that had lingered over the Pierce family for nearly a century. But what was it? What had Lionel done that required years of payments and secrecy? One night, James couldn't sleep. He paced the study, the house silent except for the faint creak of the floorboards beneath his feet. The box was still locked in the drawer, but he felt its presence like a heartbeat. Eventually, he retrieved it and placed it on the desk. The photograph caught his attention first. The couple in front of the staircase. The man stiff, the woman's face betraying a flicker of unease. James realized he had overlooked something. The staircase in the photograph didn't match the one in the foyer. At first glance, they seemed identical. The ornate balustrade, the sweeping curve, but the pattern on the risers was different. The staircase in the photo had an inlaid design, while the one in the house was plain. James felt a chill. Either the photo wasn't taken here, or the house had been altered at some point. Driven by a sudden urgency, he grabbed a flashlight and made his way to the foyer. The house was dark, the only light coming from the faint moonlight streaming through the windows. He crouched near the base of the stairs, inspecting the woodwork. At first, he saw nothing unusual, but as he ran his hand along the baseboard, his fingers caught on a faint seam in the wood. The paneling was loose. James hesitated. His heart pounded in his chest, a mix of fear and anticipation. Then, summoning his courage, he pried the panel away. Behind it was a small, dark cavity, barely large enough to reach into. He shone the flashlight inside and froze. There was something wrapped in oilcloth, discolored and brittle with age. James pulled it out carefully, his hands trembling. The cloth crumbled as he unwrapped it, revealing a stack of documents and a small metal key. The documents were fragile, the ink faded but still legible. They appeared to be contracts, legal agreements signed by Lionel Pierce. But the language was unlike anything James had ever seen. The contract spoke of guarantees of silence and obligations of debt, with repeated references to the benefactor. The terms were vague but absolute. Lionel had agreed to surrender all rights of inheritance in exchange for services rendered. One clause stood out. The undersigned acknowledges that this agreement is binding in perpetuity, not only upon himself but upon his heirs and successors. Failure to comply will result in forfeiture of all assets, including the estate at 47 Maple Hill. James's blood ran cold. The agreement wasn't just about Lionel. It extended to the entire Pierce family, and now, by extension, to him. The final page was a ledger of payments, similar to the one he had found earlier. But this one was incomplete, with several entries crossed out. At the bottom, a single phrase was scrawled in red ink. The debt remains. James sat in stunned silence, the documents spread before him. The key, small and unassuming, lay on the desk like an afterthought. He picked it up, turning it over in his hand. It was too small for any door, likely intended for a drawer or box. The realization struck him like a thunderclap. He returned to the box, his fingers working quickly to examine its underside. Sure enough, there was a hidden compartment, its edges barely visible. The key fit perfectly, and with a soft click, the compartment slid open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded and sealed with wax. James broke the seal and unfolded it. The handwriting was jagged, as though written in haste. To whom it may concern, the debt must be paid. Penance cannot be escaped. Do not look further, or you will regret what you find. James stared at the note, his pulse pounding in his ears. He had assumed the mystery of the Pierce house was rooted in the past, a story of long-dead secrets. But now he realized it wasn't over. The house's debt was still unpaid, and somehow, he had become part of it. James's hands trembled as he placed the letter back into the hidden compartment of the box. He stared at it for a long moment, his mind racing. The message wasn't just a warning, it was a threat. Someone, or something, had left it there, knowing it would eventually be found. The weight of the situation pressed down on him. This wasn't a simple case of a family scandal buried under layers of secrecy. The Pierce house itself seemed bound to an unfulfilled obligation, one that Lionel Pierce had either failed to resolve or deliberately passed on. And now, James, through his purchase of the estate, had unknowingly inherited the burden. For days, he tried to continue as normal, but the atmosphere in the house became unbearable. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the lights, felt like an accusation. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. The sense of being watched grew stronger with each passing hour, though he never saw anyone. The documents in the box had made one thing clear. The debt was real, and it was still owed. But what was it? And to whom? James decided to search the house again, convinced he had missed something. He combed through every room, every drawer, every hidden corner. His search eventually led him to the basement, a damp, stone-walled space he had largely avoided during the renovations. At first, there was nothing unusual. Old tools, rotting wood, and rusted pipes filled the space. But near the far wall, he noticed an irregularity in the stonework. One section of the wall was slightly recessed, the mortar newer than the surrounding stones. Using a crowbar, James pried at the edges until the loose stones came free, revealing a hollow cavity behind the wall. Inside, there was a single object, a leather-bound journal, its cover warped with age. The journal belonged to Lionel Pierce. Its entries were sporadic, written in a shaky hand, and grew more erratic as they progressed. The early entries detailed Lionel's financial troubles. The family had been on the brink of ruin, their fortune squandered through failed investments and mismanagement. But then, Lionel hinted at a solution. A deal brokered with a mysterious figure he referred to only as the benefactor. July 3rd, 1925. He came to me at my lowest. I could not see his face in the shadows, but his voice was calm, his promises convincing. He said he could save the house, the family name, but only if I agreed to his terms. I had no choice. The debt was my only option. November 12th, 1926. The payments are steep, but the benefactor has delivered as promised. The estate is secure, the creditors silenced. Yet I cannot shake the feeling that I have made a terrible mistake. May 8th, 1927. The fire was no accident. I know this now. It was a warning. I have failed to uphold part of our arrangement, though I do not understand how. The benefactor has reminded me that the debt is not mine alone. He said my children, their children, will bear it if I cannot repay it in full. The final entries were frantic, almost illegible. September 2nd, 1932. He comes in my dreams now, a shadow in the corner of every room. The payments are almost complete, but I fear it will not be enough. He said I must make a choice, but I do not understand what he wants. October 10th, 1932. I have hidden the ledger. It is the only proof of what I have done. If anyone finds this journal, know that the benefactor cannot be escaped. He will come for you, as he has come for me. The debt must be paid. James closed the journal, his chest tight with fear. The deal Lionel had made wasn't just financial. It was something deeper, something intangible. The reference to dreams and shadows sent a shiver down James's spine. He placed the journal on the desk beside the box and sat back, his mind spinning. For the first time, he wondered if the rumors about the Pierce house being cursed were more than just superstition. The word penance on the plaque outside the door now seemed like a cruel joke. Lionel had sought to pay his debt, but it hadn't been enough. And now, the responsibility had shifted to James. That night, James woke to the sound of footsteps. They were faint but deliberate, echoing through the halls of the house. He sat up in bed, his heart racing. Grabbing a flashlight, he crept into the hallway. The air felt heavy, as if the house itself was holding its breath. He followed the sound down the staircase and into the foyer. The front door was open. James stepped outside, the cold night air biting at his skin. The garden was still and silent, but he felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. On the ground in front of the door was an envelope. It was blank, sealed with wax identical to the note he had found in the box. With trembling hands, James opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message written in sharp, angular handwriting. The ledger is incomplete. Pay what is owed, or forfeit all. James's breath caught in his throat. He stared into the darkness, half expecting to see someone, or something, lurking in the shadows. But the garden remained empty. The next morning, James packed a bag and left the house. He couldn't stay there any longer. The Pierce house had consumed him, its secrets threatening to drag him into a web of obligations he couldn't understand. But as he drove away, he realized something chilling. Leaving didn't feel like an escape. It felt like a delay. The house, and whatever force haunted it, had marked him. The debt was no longer tied to the Pierce family alone. It was his now, whether he liked it or not. The word penance echoed in his mind. Whatever Lionel Pierce had done, whatever deal he had made, had left a stain that couldn't be erased. James didn't know what the debt entailed, but he knew one thing for certain: it would come due. As he looked in the rearview mirror, the Pierce house loomed in the distance, its white facade glowing in the morning light. It seemed to watch him, waiting for him to return.